So for our next panel, we are going to discuss the role that media, specifically conservative media, can play in a possible foreign policy realignment, where we might see the right move in a direction more favorable to realism and restraint. And so I'm Jim Antle. I'm the editor of the American Conservative. And, there was a time when conservative media really only spoke with one voice on foreign policy, and that tended to be a reflexively hawkish voice. And during the George W. Bush years, the Iraq War, there were magazines like the American Conservative and Chronicles that were opposed to the war, but the larger and older conservative institutions, with the exception of certain individual writers, were generally in favor of the war. And then in terms of important conservative columnists, really Pat Buchanan and Robert Novak were the main voices against the war. Bill Buckley and George Will turned against it later. But that was really it for a while. Some lesser known columnists like Charlie Reese as well. But now I think there's a bit more diversity, a bit more diverse perspectives on these issues. And so to discuss this with us today, we've got a august and esteemed panel. We have Will Chamberlain, who's the publisher of Human Events, recently relaunched venerable conservative publication. We have Matthew Peterson, a vice president at the Claremont Institute, founding editor of their online publication, The American Mind. And we have Daniel McCarthy, editor of Modern Age, a longtime veteran of conservative journalism and editor-at-large at the American Conservative, but now he's found, so he's at large no longer. So I want to sort of kick it off by talking about, we have one new publication represented. We have two older conservative publications under new leadership represented, and then I guess we're entering middle age, I don't know. But I want to talk about how much does the sort of ferment going on have to do with Donald Trump, and how important has Trump been to there being a little bit more of a conservative debate, or at least a dialogue rather than a monologue on foreign policy questions?
Sure. So I think he's incredibly important. I mean, I still remember back in the South Carolina debate when he told Jeb Bush that his brother had lied us into the Iraq War. And the entire mainstream media was like, you can't say that. That's a third rail. Absolutely not. And instead, he won South Carolina running away, which really indicated that the sort of stranglehold that the establishment had had on the narrative of foreign policy was gone, right? That there was just all this opportunity to suddenly change the way we think about it. So I think that Trump recognized that fundamentally the conservative base didn't actually agree, for the most part, with the Iraq War anymore or with regime change wars. And also, I think social media is just this uniquely important vehicle for challenging the kind of gatekeeping that was being done by the establishment media. I mean, I think, I just started Human Events, but I've been very active on social media for some time. And when social media is a vehicle for ridicule. I think ridicule is one of our most powerful weapons. You can make things like regime change wars look silly. You can make people advocating them look ridiculous. And it's a lot, you can make every moral argument you want, but nothing is more effective or persuasive than making people look ridiculous. And I think that's one of the things that Trump is also himself very, very good at.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Well, I agree with Will that Donald Trump has been really the primer or the explosive charge that has made everything else possible. But actually, there was a lot going on even before Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, or even before he became a candidate. The ferment that had been stirred up by candidates such as Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012 played a tremendous role. And I think that the mind of the right has been changing on these questions really ever since 2006. Back then, we saw at the American Conservative that there were more and more conservatives who were open to our views. In 2008, you had someone like Rand Paul expressing those views on a very prominent way. And by 2016, you had these views taking over the Republican Party through Donald Trump. In some ways, I would actually challenge perhaps Jim Antle's premise, however. It seems to me that you're quite right about the one voice that was sort of imposed on everyone in 2003 with the Iraq War, but that was in many respects a departure from the best traditions of the American right. If you look back to the 1920s, for example, you see the granddaddy of all the conservative publications, The Freeman, edited by Francis Nielsen and Albert J. Nock, was strongly critical of World War I and of America's interventionist foreign policy tradition as expressed by Woodrow Wilson and by various others of that era, all the way through to something like The National Interest being founded in 1985 by Irving Kristol, an actual neoconservative, and Owen Harries, who was a realist from Australia. You have a tradition where the right is not necessarily always non-interventionist in its publications, and in fact, throughout the Cold War, you had a center of gravity that was relatively pro-interventionist, but there was always space for realists, and there was always some degree of room for discussion and dissent. You even saw this in National Review, for example, in 1991, where there was not uniformity and not one voice with respect to the first Persian Gulf War. Wick Allison, for example, who was the publisher of National Review at that time, published some dissenting pieces in the magazine criticizing Gulf War I. And even though the magazine as a whole came around to supporting Gulf War I in 1991, the very next year, in 1992, the magazine actually endorsed Pat Buchanan in the New Hampshire primaries. So the closing of the conservative mind around 2003 with the Iraq War was something of a departure from the traditions that really had stretched back some 80 years or so.
Matthew, you represent the youngest publication here. What are some of your perspectives on this?
Well, I would say first, we need to acknowledge the American people have been open to this conversation for quite some time. And Trump maybe opened up the space for it, but I think what's astounding to me when it comes to foreign policy is that the vast majority of ordinary Americans are much more open to conversation and debate than, say, the folks in the city are. And so there's lots of space. And Trump realized that from the beginning. My reflecting on this panel before coming here, I realized, at the time when 2003, I mean, you just used bad words to describe this dark time, right? But at the time, I think what's astounding is it's an anomaly because everything moved in one direction. Even when there were a lot more people than we think speaking out, and so Claremont's actually a great example of that. The Claremont Institute, I still don't know why many paleocon-leaning or friendly folks would call us neoconservative when you had Harry Jaffa, Charles Kessler, Angela Codevilla coming out right from the beginning and saying there's enormous problems with the way we're approaching the response to 9/11. But all that kind of got lost, right? It kind of got lost and taken up in the noise of the time. But now I think what you see is a lot of younger publications and younger people, frankly, much more open to these debates. And if I had a single message, it would be, I mean, when you're talking to young elites on the right, under 40, under 30, they think very differently about these things. And they have no problem speaking about this stuff, except for the fact that those who are older than them and run institutions don't want to hear many of the questions they have. So I hope what you'll see is more publications like American Mind allowing for debate and discussion.
So would you all say that the shift in the tone in conservative media, is it a supply side phenomenon or a demand side phenomenon? Is it there are new publications out there that deviate from the 2000s consensus, or is it the readership has changed and the market has responded accordingly?
I think it was a supply side problem, right? I don't think there were enough magazines making the point, enough voices making the point. People, again, I think about this through the terms of social media. It's hard to make things go viral. You surf the wave, and really very quickly through social media, you get a sense of what people like and what people don't. And I can tell you personally that, when I want to get traction on social media, I attack Mitt Romney or Bill Kristol, right? Like, that's a really reliable way to get retweets, right, is to make fun of Mitt Romney. People really don't like him. And I think underlying that is a fact that people were really frustrated with their leadership. I mean, it really was speaking with one voice. If you wanted to get on Fox, it seems, if you wanted to get access to the serious institutions that had platforms, you needed to fall in line on foreign policy. That just doesn't matter anymore. You can break in through Twitter. You can break in by starting a new publication. You don't need to go through and get Bill Kristol's stamp of approval to have a relevant voice on foreign policy now. And what matters is whether people agree with you. So I think the problem was supply side, not demand side.
Mm-hmm. You know, we've talked about that South Carolina debate. Certainly, Ron Paul had a major impact on Republican thinking on some of these issues, but it was the case that when he made some of the points, now he made them in a very different way, but when he made some of the points about the Iraq War in 2007 on the stage with Rudy Giuliani, then America's mayor, now the president's lawyer, Ron Paul was practically thrown off the stage. People wanted to throw him out of the party. When Donald Trump got up and made those points, there seemed to be a lot more assent from rank and file. So I wonder how much of that is a result of people changing their minds on these issues, or how much of that has to do with Trump emotionally and Pat Buchanan, I think, in the 90s could fit this description somewhat too, emotionally bonded with the Republican base in a way that rank and file voters were more willing to trust their instincts and tolerate their deviationism on that. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Jim, you know, actually, the surprising thing, I worked for the Ron Paul campaign in 2008, and the very surprising thing was that South Carolina showdown with Rudy Giuliani was in fact the beginning of the campaign. It really shot it into the first tier of Republican contest, and it was Giuliani who wound up kind of losing steam after that, not Ron Paul. That shows, I think, that Will is exactly right. There was a supply-side problem. There were not enough institutions, not enough prominent voices saying the things that many conservatives actually believed. And in many cases, the conservative base believed it, but because there was no one to articulate it, they just kind of went along with whatever orders they were getting from Bill Kristol or whomever else. But as soon as you had prominent figures like Ron Paul and Donald Trump come forward and start to say the things that deep down other conservative voters really believed, then you saw an almost immediate change. And it's true that Ron Paul faced certain obstacles because he was very much coming from a libertarian and a very sort of absolutist libertarian point of view, and so that limited his reach into the conservative mind. But it was clear that Donald Trump expanded on that, and even Ron Paul was able to become such a force in the Republican Party to the point of getting his son elected to the U.S. Senate, for example, and a number of other figures in the House, because he took this stand which resonated not only with libertarian-leaning Republicans, but with a very wide number of Republicans indeed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which I think there's a rhetorical trap when it comes to all this that arises from the force of established thinking for decades, and that's what makes it difficult. So for someone like Paul, if you already have an ideological framework and you start speaking in this way that's very outside the box, right? It's much harder for people to grab onto, whereas Trump was just commonsensical, saying the same things that they were thinking as they had friends and relatives go through the war in Iraq and come back or not. This was a disaster. This didn't work. We can call it. This was a failure. We can say this did not work. That's not controversial to the American people at all. And the only presidents they've elected since Bush have been able to acknowledge that fact publicly. But I think the problem is, and the challenge moving forward is the rhetorical play or the trap you can fall into is that there's some kind of binary, right? And if you're not part of the Borg, then you're this other extreme thing, and then there's all kinds of names you can use for that, isolationist, et cetera. And the American people have a very common sense view, but there's not a counter-establishment, and that's probably the biggest complaint I'll hear from younger folks that we either teach through Claremont programs or are associated with because of the American mind. Foreign policy is probably the one area in which they say, could you or someone else just come out and host some discussion, some debate that no other organization would allow for. They wouldn't let it happen. And notice they're not saying, we want you to come and yell and scream at all the establishment and say this is all terrible. We actually want to have some sensible discussions. Like, isn't this a valid question? What's your response, right? And they want to develop, right, their own establishment that has a different kind of cohesion and priorities. But to do that is very, very difficult in the environment we're in right now, as you know.
I remember back during the Iraq War, you would frequently hear conservatives, particularly those who specialize in economic and budget issues, quietly say, yeah, I don't know about this whole Iraq thing. And by about 2006, some were even saying it not so quietly, but the conservatives who were specializing in foreign policy particularly, that was their point of emphasis, did remain sort of disproportionately hawkish really through the whole duration of the Iraq War. To what extent do we see that still being the case now, where neoconservatives still dominate foreign policy writing on the center right or on the right?
I mean, I think that actually it's been much better recently. I think that most of the people who were kind of bullying around conservative intellectual thought in the 2000s are now on MSNBC talking about how terrible the president is. Right, like that's David Frum, that's Max Boot, that's Bill Kristol. Like they're not on Fox News anymore, unless Bret Baier can occasionally, sneak them on. But I mean, there's a reason for that. I think that ultimately they went really hard against Trump, and in fact they went really hard against Trump starting after the South Carolina debate. Right before that, Bill Kristol, all of them could have probably dealt with Trump. They dealt with Sarah Palin, they could have dealt with Trump. But the moment he said the Iraq War was wrong, the moment he said, you can't let that Bush lied us into that was beyond the pale. Of all the things that Trump did, for that to be beyond the pale is remarkable, when you think about it.
Another name that we haven't mentioned is Tucker Carlson, who's obviously a pretty important voice, hosts a popular show on Fox News, represents a foreign policy perspective that we didn't really hear very much on Fox a decade ago. But has a very popular show, is a widely recognized conservative, has a lot of credibility with conservatives. To what extent do voices like that matter in changing perspectives?
I think that's enormous. I mean, I think Tucker Carlson's show is one of the most interesting phenomenons, and I mean, it's astounding to me what that show has accomplished and what it proves in the time it's been on. So he's speaking to the demographic you would think would be, where we were told would be the most against any kind of new thinking when it comes to, I mean, it's Fox News, right? I mean, the parody shows the big war airplanes come dropping bombs. I mean, we know. So what has he proven? Well, he's shown that, American people are very open to rethinking foreign policy because it's obvious to anyone who has eyes to see that in the last 20 years, things haven't gone so well. That doesn't mean that they adopt some clear stance in opposition, but what Tucker's popularity proves is they're fine with asking these questions. They're fine with that. It hasn't affected him at all.
And you can see what would happen if you didn't have Tucker Carlson and if the opinions being expressed on Fox News were only those of Sean Hannity. That would have certainly a demoralizing effect on anyone on the right who disagreed with the interventionist side of foreign policy. And it would, it's not that it would change the fundamental common sense beliefs of conservative voters that Matt has alluded to, but it would leave them feeling leaderless, leave them feeling undirected, unguided. So it really does make a difference to have these institutions and these individuals, to have Tucker Carlson, to have the American Mind, to have Human Events, and to have the American Conservative. All of these things are transforming, not because they are taking something that was radically different, that they're taking sort of malleable conservative voters and turning them in a direction they would not otherwise want to go. It's rather because these institutions and persons are articulating the deepest sort of common sense beliefs and the spirit of conservative voters and of the American people. But if you don't have a channel for that, if all you have are people who are constantly misrepresenting and twisting the instincts of the American people toward interventionism, then you really will get the kind of monolithic conditions we all suffered under in 2003.
It's also sort of interesting that the Democratic presidential candidate who seems to be most popular among conservatives if not Andrew Yang, is Tulsi Gabbard, who also is the most outspoken on these foreign policy issues. I don't think it's entirely just because of her views on foreign policy. She seems to have an open-mindedness on a number of other issues, despite being largely a progressive. And progressives seem to distrust her because they think she's some kind of closet conservative. But you know, what role do figures like that play, particularly given you know, it's less clear where sort of Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren would take us on some of these issues?
Well, I think she demonstrates a kind of form of almost like liberal nationalism, if you will. I think if you look at every other of the major foreign policy, major Democratic presidential candidates, I don't think you could use the word nationalist to describe them at all. Right? They do not care about the nation. I mean, Bernie Sanders just came out with an immigration plan that is open borders in all but name, right? Decriminalizing border crossings and things of that nature. But when you listen to Tulsi Gabbard talk about foreign policy and even domestic policy, you can say, okay, I disagree with that. Okay, I think that's a bad idea. But you wouldn't say, oh, she's not patriotic. Oh, she doesn't care about her country. Like you clearly there's
unless you're Hillary Clinton.
Unless you're Hillary Clinton, in which case she's a Russian asset. Right? You know, it's funny. All these people criticize everyone for xenophobia and then accuse everyone on the other who disagrees with them of being a Russian asset. This fascinating dichotomy there. But yeah, I think that's where sort of the right's respect for Tulsi comes from, is that she's articulating what I think it would be a return to a kind of 1990s version of the Democratic Party, which is a more nationalist and a world. You know, I think it would be good for a Tulsi Gabbard type to win a Democratic nomination, because that would represent much more of a return to a peacetime politics where there's almost a bipartisan consensus on things like nationalism is okay. Right? I mean, even if we disagree radically on economic policy, because I see a radical divergence between us and, say, a Cory Booker or a Julian Castro or a Kamala Harris, that is just almost irreconcilable. So I think Republicans hope that a Tulsi-like figure takes control of the Democrats, even if they disagree with her.
So what happens if the next Republican nominee or even president is somebody like Nikki Haley or even Mike Pence? Do we go back to the way things were under Bush, or do you think this diversity of conservative thought will continue?
Well, I think it's actually, it's very hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? So you'd have to crush these new institutions that have sprung up. You'd have to get Tucker Carlson off the air of Fox News. You'd have to really dismantle a lot of infrastructure that has been built up since the Iraq War, when, you know, the realist and relatively non-interventionist side of the right had virtually no institutions. Before the American Conservative came along, really Chronicles magazine was about the only, you know, sort of consistently non-interventionist conservative organization out there. Although there were, as Matt points out, there were actually a lot of other individual voices and even a kind of center of gravity at places like Claremont, which tended to get overlooked because of the factional struggles of the 1990s, where it was assumed that everyone who had a realist or non-interventionist view on foreign policy must necessarily be a paleo, which was never true. I mean, there were always people like Jeane Kirkpatrick, for example, who were realists and were relatively non-interventionist, who did not belong in that basket. And the polarization that you saw along these neo-paleo lines in the late 1980s and the 1990s really caused a lot of confusion and a lot of common sense policies, especially in foreign policy, to be overlooked or to be caricatured or to be miscast and misrepresented. So, but I think it would be very hard to go back to those days, simply because you do have these new institutions and new leaders of opinion who are out there and able to say things which Bill Kristol cannot silence.
Yeah, I mean, you went right to the right to the big ball of wax with that question. I mean, I'll just be frank. I do think about what would happen if, whether or not there's another term for Trump, the Republican Party decides to post up Nikki Haley, say, in 2024, and I think the results would be disastrous. I know a lot of people who would quietly say that might be the last Republican. You know, Trump might be the last Republican nominee for that reason, if there's that kind of return. At the same time, you can throw in the fact that it's not clear what a candidate would be, right? It's not as an alternative. To say Trumpism doesn't register, doesn't mean much. And I think I go back again to the main problem is you can have institutions and magazines that speak out against what exists. But until you have your own expert class of people who've been in and out of government, who have a principled way and an easy rhetorical way of describing the alternative, right? I mean, that's where the issue is. So I think this isn't just foreign policy, by the way. On almost every area of policy where the Republican Party ought to learn from Trump and reform itself, right? The danger is that there's a brief window of time in which the party could reform itself in order to become a majority party for the next generation and a winner. And the question is, will it do that? And I'm not optimistic. So you would need, in other words, we just need more. We need more discussion and more, again, serious argument, right, between people who are in power and have been in power and people who are asking questions and trying to develop something new. Now, I mean, the level of debate is really poor and it's terrible. And when I go back in preparation for this and reading the old, Codevilla essays, et cetera, I mean, it's astounding that we were saying, look, this is Wilsonian. I mean, this is not conservative by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, Charles Kessler wrote about the Bush Doctrine and said, why would you think that you're going to free people and they're going to treat everyone equally and fine, and the principles of the Declaration are just going to, emerge in their hearts and it's all going to be great? Why would you think that, right? Did that go anywhere, right? I mean, so there's a lot of work to be done, and it's very unclear what happens in the future, I think.
One thing we haven't touched upon is the sort of rift that is emerging between libertarians and sort of populist nationalists on the right, where these are people who are largely in agreement on foreign policy, but increasingly disagree over economics, or at least the utility of using government power to resolve certain domestic concerns, certain domestic problems. Does that pose any kind of risks for the changing foreign policy consensus on the right?
I don't think so, because I don't think the libertarians are going to win that one. I think that, there's a couple of reasons. One is that people, I'm a big believer that self-defeating principles are bad, and so are most conservative voters. And ultimately, the libertarian policy platform is one that alienates a huge chunk of the people who vote for the right generally, right? 2/3 of the conservative voters are working class. You can't just run a pure Ayn Randian foreign domestic policy and expect to keep those people around. Similarly, on immigration, the kind of libertarian emphasis on open borders results in a democratic, long-term sustainable democratic majority. That's not something Republicans are going to go along with. So that's, I think, reason one. And reason two is that, it's just following on that, if you actually want a non-interventionist foreign policy, you certainly don't want Democrats in charge. Libya, Syria, they were, all for going forward aggressively on that. The only meaningful non-interventionist force in American politics is on the right today. So I don't think that, and especially if foreign policy is as central as I think we all think it is, especially for the presidency, I don't see libertarians winning the argument here. And so they didn't win it in 2016, and I don't think they're going to win it going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of, just to hop in on that, it's helpful to have these different voices and these different philosophical perspectives on the right. The libertarians have always been very helpful in sort of spurring conservatives to return to first principles and to define and justify why they agree with libertarians up to a certain point but part ways with them on the more fundamental questions. So there's always some utility in having this mix of perspectives. And one of the crucial things the American Conservative magazine did in the last decade was to show that while the American Conservative certainly had a paleo center of gravity, it was founded by Pat Buchanan and Scott McConnell and Taki Theodorakopoulos, that the American Conservative was always open to libertarian anti-war views or non-interventionist views, to even certain progressive anti-interventionist views that were, in other respects, simpatico or at least relatively tolerant of and friendly to conservatives. So there was a grand coalition there, and it was a way to show that the sort of caricature of a paleo isolationist point of view was not really representative of the entire spectrum of opinion that was critical of, for example, the Iraq War and the various things that George W. Bush was doing. But now, in the 21st century, as we get into its third decade, it's becoming much more important that there be a conservative mainstream again, not in order to have uniformity of opinion, but in order that we don't over-rely on our libertarian allies to supply foreign policy credentials, for example, or rely on other elements that we found common cause with against the Iraq War in order to try to supply things that we don't have in terms of a native bench of talent. And the reason why this matters is because you're not going to staff a Republican administration or even a Republican congressional office with pure libertarian, sort of credentialed Cato Institute people. They're going to have to be people who represent, as Will has alluded to, what conservative voters actually believe in terms of the national interest, in terms of immigration and trade policy and so forth. And so there's a need to, while continuing to have a dialogue with our allies among the libertarians and even on certain parts of the left, like Tulsi Gabbard, there is this fundamental need to reclaim the idea that conservatism per se, conservatism itself in the traditions of people like Russell Kirk, for example, is very much a realist philosophy and is very much a non-utopian and relatively non-interventionist philosophy.
So let's throw it open to audience questions. Hopefully these will be questions, as in sentences that end with question marks. Does anybody have any questions for our panel of
Yes, sir.
unpatriotic
My name is
conservatives?
Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about Iranian missile hitting Saudi Arabia. Who is the winner? Iran didn't own it. Bibi Netanyahu, I don't know how Bibi Netanyahu can sleep without sleeping pills because he lost his very powerful switch in the White House named Jared Kushner. And the real question is about Trump. Normally, American media give impression that this guy is fool. He doesn't have brain. He is a crook. Whatever, but he came across as a very, very strong person, a man of conviction. He promised during election that he is not going to intervene in Middle East, and that's what he did. Even Bibi Netanyahu couldn't do anything. So, I mean, does it kind of, did he counter American media, the kind of impression they were giving about Trump? Is he successful telling them that I'm a man of conviction and I keep my word, whatever he promised during election? Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts on just has Trump kept his promises on some of these things? And it was the perception of him in the campaign the same as people perceive him governing?
I think he broadly has kept his promises, or at least tried to do so with respect to foreign policy. The trouble is, every institutional apparatus is against him. The military is very scared of losing traction by leaving these Middle East engagements. They don't want to expand them. The military doesn't want to put its personnel at risk, but it also is afraid of how things are going to look if they pull out. In terms of what remains of the Republican Party sort of neocon foreign policy establishment, it still, of course, very much wants to keep us involved. So Trump is fighting against a lot of forces that are actually supposed to be responsive to him, whether it's the bureaucracy or the military or parts of the conservative movement that are in fact pushing a radically different foreign policy, a radically more interventionist and Bush-style one. So I think that's what has limited Trump's effectiveness. And Trump, unfortunately, has this tendency to take certain half measures. So with Syria, for example, or with sort of pulling out of other conflicts in the region, he tends to express an interest in doing so, and then he gets a lot of pushback from the mainstream media, from elements within the government, and then he will sort of adjust his policy afterwards and try to, sort of propitiate a lot of his critics. And I think Trump should be more Trumpian and less eager to be, a sort of ordinary foreign policy president.
Next question.
Jim Jatras, former State Department, former Senate Republican leadership staff. There have been a few mentions of neoconservatives, but nobody has really mentioned Israel. And of course, as a factor in I'm not one of those who says it's all about Israel, but it is a factor. And not just with neoconservatives. I was listening to Christian radio in Virginia the other day, and there was strong Trump supporter people denouncing him for his Syria policy because it would endanger Israel and Ezekiel 38 and Togarmah and the King of the North and all of this stuff. And I guess my question is, how big a factor is Israel in an interventionist foreign policy versus a more non-interventionist or national interest-based policy, realist policy? And how would a transition be managed from an interventionist foreign policy to a realist or non-interventionist policy, taking Israel into account not only the neoconservative firepower, but a very important constituency in the Republican Party.
Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it plays less of a role than a lot of people I've heard from on the right seem to think. I think, from the American perspective, they're an important ally, and maintaining their security is relevant. And I think even in a world where we're more non-interventionist, I mean, there's a lot of value that the Israeli alliance provides to the United States. And that said, I don't think that, much of, I'm sure that the Israelis look at something like the Iraq War the way we do, in terms of like a big giant foreign policy mistake that didn't help their interests at all and create a whole bunch of problems that they had to deal with. From their perspective, it's more, I mean, I think what Israel's really afraid of is sort of a democratic takeover and then sort of dictating their domestic policy to them in the West Bank and Gaza. I think they're just, in general, they just want Republicans to be in power and to be, and support and how they deal with the Palestinians. And as long as that's happening, I don't think they have too many problems, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, it's just, the problem is the fallacy that Israel is always for intervention, when they've looked at us many times and said, what the heck are you guys doing? I think it's interesting, though, that the left has kind of backed off a little bit that issue in the national press. You remember Jerusalem was going to be a big deal, and they've kind of gone quiet on that.
Yeah, an interventionist will use whatever kinds of foreign contexts are available in order to argue for more wars. So they'll do it with Ukraine, they'll do it with the Kurds. They don't necessarily have to frame everything in terms of, Israel. Basically, they will always be using these claims that if the U.S. doesn't take action, some, virtuous group somewhere else in the world will suffer terribly as a result. But all of these considerations stand in light of a reality that Americans have perceived over the last 15 years of a Middle East policy which has been catastrophic for the region's Christians, and which has, left them in a far worse condition than they were in before the Iraq War began. So even though there is, people have these attachments and these romantic notions that form about, the Kurds or about any other group, and yet if they look at what is actually happening to the Christian populations of the region, I think that creates a great deal of it flips the narrative. It basically says, you know what, some of the most vulnerable people in the region are actually even more endangered because of our policies. And that's true in Syria, that was true in Iraq, and it's going to be true if we engage in further sort of regime change and nation-building wars.
All right, we're going to do a lightning round, so ask a question and then let the next person ask a question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Sure thing. As a young guy, I'm hoping to learn from your guys' successes in my own career. And so I'm wondering if each of you can point to a specific victory or a specific accomplishment in your career where one of your writings, one of your projects, your publication that you were a part of, where you saw a concrete result, that you influenced a conversation, you changed an election, you shaped a policy debate, and what you learned from that. But if each of you could just point to somewhere where you feel like you've had a very proud accomplishment and your writing and your thinking, your work has accomplished something.
Okay.
If you had the power to do so, who would you replace among President Trump's current foreign policy and national security advisor? Who would you replace among them, and who would you, if you dare say, come up with suggestions as who that? And that also goes for the swamp, the U.S. State Department.
Okay, thanks.
Since the United States is a role model for the concept of freedom of speech, three topics run into my mind. Hate speech. There is absolutely an ongoing precedence at this moment, whereas it doesn't matter which party you side with, or essentially people will be censored online. And so I think my question is more over to Will, who has a lot of experience on social media, on a professional level. Can you give us some feedback or advice, guidance on how future users that use these platforms can offer their opinion in this world, whereas we are seeing a detrimental consequences happening, whether if your accounts are being shut down or blocked for the little excuse of hate speech, and how is the U.S. going to be how is this going to play out with the U.S. as a role model of freedom of speech to publicize this everywhere? Thank you.
Okay, let's try to get two more.
Thanks. I'm John Utley, a publisher of the American Conservative, actually. But I'd written a lot on defense, and my question to you, sequestration, an article I wrote, is the only way to cut defense waste, forcing them to make decisions. And you'll know how they hated it more than anything else. It was controlling the budget deficits, and I ask you to, if you all can say how to get it back on the table. That's perhaps the only way that we can have some way of cutting the waste.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
My specific question is about how advocates of restraint can win back the word realism, given the fact that most of the administration and current mainstream conservatisms advocate, most interventionist actions are defined and defended in realist language rather than in neoconservative language. It's no longer about spreading democracy. Now, seizing the oil in Syria is seen as a realist move rather than as one about values or democracy or anything like that. So I'm curious how restraint can win back being the realist opposition.
Okay, that's a lot. So we'll try to do repealing and replacing the Trump administration, accomplishments, sequestration, or just one more person. Okay,
yes, you couldn't see me. I was shorter, so you couldn't see me standing in the.
Go ahead.
Okay, Marta Verbatic from Wilson Center. I could not follow the conference in the morning fully, so I hope I'm not saying something what hasn't been said before. I just want to say, share briefly my opinion and get your response to this. While I'm not for non-interventionist policy, I'm certainly for policy with restraint. And I'm concerned about our interventions and how we intervene into identity conflicts, let's say like Bosnia. And that our view that, let's say, power sharing is a bad idea, that we want to build some idealized United States, image of United States there as a multi-ethnic society where the society is actually divided, and that we criticize power sharing arrangements as nationalism, and where this is reality. And I feel that sometimes what we are doing is really projecting our idealized version of United States, which no longer exists. We ourselves have identity problems here, and identity politics here is gaining such a strength. So why are we going in these countries and trying to preach something that we have problem with?
Thank you.
All right.
So a concise 30-second reaction to all of those questions would be ideal.
I'll be quick as I can. Accomplishment is my Twitter thread on the National Emergency Declaration. The entire establishment had lined up behind this idea that it was unlawful, but they apparently didn't read the statute. I did a thread, and eventually Trump reversed himself, and I don't know how much credit I deserve for that, but I think I deserve a little. The second question was about
the Trump administration?
Oh yeah, I'm going to skip that one. I don't know. They got rid of McMaster. I'm fine. The third one was about social media, how to use it and not get banned. Well, first, I think as a proposition, I think Republicans generally need to think about making platform access a civil right. I've written articles on this fact. This is where I really depart from libertarians. They generally are very opposed to intervention broadly and any sort of use of government. I think a world where we allow Democrats to kick every major influencer off of social media is a world where Republicans lose. I don't believe in self-defeating principles. And somebody else said, how can we push the message of anti-regime change? I think one thing I really want to talk about is the power of mockery and ridicule as opposed to the idea of regime change. So during the Venezuela uprising, my friends and I were pushing something called #RegimeChangeForFrance, arguing that, given the Yellow Vest riots, there was clearly an illegitimate leader, and that we need to appoint Marine Le Pen as the interim the interim president of France, which seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The point being that like these things need to be more of a joke when people advocate them, and so and I think that's enough. 4 of 6 is fine.
Anybody want to hit sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, I think sequestration is a very different kind of battle from the fights we need to take on in order to stay out of interventions. So even as you had sequestration, you still had the Obama administration pursuing a fairly aggressive foreign policy. The idea that cutting the military spending is necessarily going to lead to a more peaceful foreign policy is unfortunately not correct. Now, these may both be good policies, staying out of wars and also reducing our military spending, but you can fight one of those battles without fighting the other necessarily. So someone like Ronald Reagan certainly massively increased spending on the military, but he did not engage in the kinds of large-scale wars that so many of his successors did. And so I, as someone who is much more concerned about strategy than about the debt, I would much rather see us have a less interventionist foreign policy, regardless of what that means for military spending. So I'm not terribly troubled by Donald Trump's increase of our military spending, just as I wasn't troubled by Ronald Reagan's. In a perfect world, I would prefer to address that as well. I'd prefer to limit it, reduce it, but it's a much lesser evil than having someone who's going to reduce the size of the military while actually increasing the number of operations and interventions we engage in.
Matt, you want to say anything about identity politics or anything else?
Yeah, I'll give my 30 seconds. On Trump, I would say, look, I'm glad that Tucker Carlson is part of the cabinet. I hope he remains so. That's a good thing. He might not be right about everything, but he seems to be there. I think that question reminds me of the real problem, which goes to real achievements that I am proud of, but that really are needed nationally, and that's this. I'm going to go back to this. The thing that's needed now is a lot of people who are willing to rethink foreign policy, but they need space and a place in which to do it. And it's not gonna work if it's a bunch of writers and thinkers, right, in our own little spots railing against the establishment. We really need to build a new foreign policy moving forward, and we see the way forward, I think, in the last 3 years. You can see the outlines of it, but that's gonna be really hard work, and it's gonna require institutional space for people to really rethink and build anew.
That's great. Thank you all very much. I think this was a good discussion.